thesis statement she's defending is without much contact with a person with dissociative identity disorder or much knowledge of dissociative identity disorder, and with the influence of thriller films, the average person has a tendency to make harmful assumptions and become fearful of a person with this disorder. Please welcome Ms. Drozda.
Another distinct awareness of my voices can be how they make me feel. For example, I may be walking through a shopping center and feel extremely anxious. I feel sweaty and nervous. This sensation of feeling overwhelmed can trigger one of my voices we'll call Jim. Suddenly, I feel Jim's presence. It's like he's walking beside me. And just like that, my anxiety reduces. Nothing has changed in the shopping center. The environment is the same. All this has happened in a few seconds. No one around me would know what happened. How would you respond if someone told you that these were their daily inner thoughts? I want you to imagine your initial reaction. Would you show compassion? Would you judge? Or would you avoid them altogether? Dissociative identity disorder is a mental health disorder that can be very confusing. Not many people know it exists, or those who have heard of it, most likely through movies or unreliable internet sources, have a general misconception and uncompassionate perspective of a person living and suffering with this disorder. Without much contact with a person with dissociative identity disorder, or much knowledge of dissociative identity disorder, and with the influence of thriller films, the average person has a tendency to make harmful assumptions and become fearful of a person with this disorder. Dissociative identity disorder can be described as a fragmentation of the identity characterized by the presence of two or more distinct personality states. And it specifies that dissociative symptoms such as discontinuity in self or consciousness, referred to as switching, may either be observed by others or reported by the individual, him or herself. Dissociative identity disorder was previously known as multiple personality disorder by the American Psychiatric Association, but it was changed in 1994. This significant revision was made because the former multiple personality disorder title highlighted characteristics of the disorder that can be most significantly and dangerously misleading. The phrase multiple personalities appears to imply that there are multiple people in one body, when in reality, the one patient's brain is in fragments. DID, short for dissociative identity disorder, is focused on the internal happenings of the mind. The core of DID is the division of identity, with the recurrent disruption of conscious functioning and sense of self. Merriam-Webster defines dissociation as the process to separate from association or union with another. It is a state of mind where the body and mind are not united. The brain is disconnected from everything. DID is a mental health disorder that can be medically diagnosed, that has been medically diagnosed to only 1.5% of US adults. The National Alliance on Mental Illness explains, dissociative disorders develop as a way of dealing with trauma. Dissociative disorders most often form in children exposed to long-term physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. The abuse the child goes through is so traumatic, it causes the brain to take on an alternate identity known as alters. Alters are the brain's defense mechanism of a person dealing with this disorder. The DSM-5's criteria for diagnosing an individual with dissociative identity disorder is the following. 1. The person must have two or more alternate identity states. 2. There must be an obvious disruption of identity. 3. The individual experiences dissociative amnesia or gaps in memory of daily events, personal information, and traumatic events. And 4. The aforementioned behavior affects all three areas of a person's life, including social, professional, and familial relationships. The major symptoms of DID are dissociation, blackouts, and hearing voices. Switching usually takes place when the person is overstressed or they bring up a part of the trauma that they cannot handle. Switching from one identity or alter to another is a smooth transition which is difficult to detect, especially if the patient is trying to conceal the disorder. An identity switch usually does not last longer than 5 minutes. Looking back on past medical treatments, they were in a large part terrifying, unsterile, illogical, and counterproductive compared to the more humane and effective treatments we have today. Mental illness was not really brought into the focus of medical personnel until the 1900s. Mental health was not yet a societal or a medical concern. Mental illness existed, yet no one knew. People in the medieval ages thought any unordinary experiences were of supernatural causes. Author and UC Berkeley Professor Emeritus Stephen Justice states that people of the medieval ages were apt and prepared to see everywhere traces of the direct intervention of God. Their senses were deadened to the commonplace and unusually aware of strange or peculiar circumstances. A presentiment, a coincidence, a flicker of light in an unusual place might suggest a miracle for which there were a dozen parallels. It is highly likely that those individuals who struggled with mental health disorders during this time period were wrongfully accused of being plagued with ghosts or demons. Consequently, the individual struggling with mental health disorder during this time most likely believed these accusations to be true. As previously mentioned, modern studies show that childhood trauma and abuse are the underlying trigger of individuals suffering with dissociative identity disorder. Unfortunately, child negligence and abuse are timeless afflictions. Modern case studies show that an accurate diagnosis of DID was mistaken in certain circumstances as supernatural during this time period due to the lack of knowledge of the disorder. Over the decades, TV has been very influential to the average person, but there are important distinctions to be made between genres. Action, romance, comedy are the main genres in many current popular films. Films and TV shows in general are not meant to portray reality, unless it is the goal of the makers of the film. It must be clarified because there are many things portrayed on TV that could confuse the average person, especially if the subject is not well known. Since there are very few people who actually know the true attributes of a person with DID, its portrayal in thriller films is often problematic. The main problem is not that the thriller movies are exaggerated. That's what makes a movie a thriller. Exaggeration and intensity. Its purpose is to excite and entertain. Weberman states, although DID is missing from almost all research on mental illness and violence, it gets an inordinate amount of focus in films about mental illness, particularly those in the horror and thriller genres, such as Split, Psycho, Fight Club, or Secret Window, which portray people with dissociative self-states as prone to violence, including homicide. It is detrimental to the health of the person with dissociative identity disorder if those around them, both in the family and in the workplace, treat or encounter the disorder in an inappropriate way. Examples of said behavior include both being scared of the person because they have a dissociative identity disorder diagnosis, or avoiding him or her because they are seen as a danger or threat to society. Because thriller films are often the only source of visual representation of a person to the average person has of DID, it is crucial to know the distinction between Hollywood's portrayal and the true symptoms of the characteristics of the disorder. Family and friends of a person diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder must understand that their support is valued and important to the patient's treatment. DID, like many illnesses, differs from person to person. Compassion and understanding by loved ones is especially important. Fear can be the wall put up between relationships, and that will only add to further mental damage to the patient struggling with DID. Relationships are hard to come by with a person struggling with any mental disorder in general, but even more so with dissociative identity disorder. Thinking that you know a person who you love well, and then seeing them almost a whole different person can be baffling. Yet with medical intervention, tools for appropriate and healthy communication between the alters can be achieved. Psychiatrist Dr. Kadir states, psychotherapy is the most common modality of treatment for DID clients. The focus of psychotherapy is to help the client understand what may have caused this condition and find new ways of coping with stressful circumstances that can trigger dissociation. The process of psychotherapy involves working through a trauma that triggers the symptoms of dissociation. Therapy for someone with DID will help guide them and allow them to gain tools to face trauma that the brain could not previously handle. As previously mentioned, the alternate identities are not different people or entities living inside one person. The person's brain functions are fractured. They are parts of one whole person. This fracturing of the brain most likely can never be fully healed. So family and friends must show the necessary compassion and patience to navigate the many challenges that may arise. Fortunately, modern society has a more accurate understanding about mental disorders than our ancestors did. Those that have hidden their disorders out of fear are now able to be better understood. Thanks to the advanced research and many studies of people with dissociative identity disorder can understand their disorder better than before, yet a negative stigma still remains. We are called to respond to those suffering with dissociative identity disorder with a generous spirit of compassion and understanding. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 20, verse 35, St. Luke the Evangelist writes, "In every way I have shown you that by hard work of that sort you must help the weak, and keep in mind the words of the Lord Jesus, who himself has said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" So I ask again, if you were to encounter someone struggling with dissociative identity disorder, would you show compassion? Would you judge? Or would you avoid them altogether? Thank you.